Congratulations! If you are watching this video, that probably means that you have finished the skeletal system. Your reward now is to learn all the muscles. Here we go. Let's take a quick review, though, from what we learned in the histology unit. So there are three types of muscle tissues. We have the first type we've talked about is smooth muscle, where there are no striations. That's all about involuntary movement. This is the stuff that's found in the walls of hollow organs. The function of that is to force substances through. If you think like your stomach, that's all smooth muscle that is squeezing that chyme into the small intestine. Then we have number 2 is the cardiac muscle. That is striated, and that is involuntary movement. It is found only in the heart. It is a really interesting kind of tissue, but we will talk about that more in the cardiovascular unit. The third type, and one of the main types we'll be focusing on throughout this unit, is skeletal muscle. This is striated, and it is also responsible for voluntary movement. It is, as the name might imply, connected to the skeleton for the most part, and its primary function is mobility. And that is stuff that we already know, so we're going to move right on here to the new stuff. So there are a few key characteristics of muscle tissue that we have not talked about in much detail. The first characteristic we're going to talk about is contractibility. That's just the ability to shorten or thicken, to contract. These are all easy words to break down. Ability, right? The ability to shorten and thicken. Elasticity, that's the ability to recoil, think like a band of elastic. Now that we're all wearing these masks, we all have a really ready example of elastic. Then extensibility, that's the ability to stretch or extend, obviously kind of the opposite of contractibility. And they are also very excitable. So they have the characteristic of excitability. That is the ability to receive and respond to stimulus. There are also a few functions. We've talked about producing movement, but there are a few other specific functions that we'll want to point out in this unit. They produce movement, obviously. They also help to maintain posture and body position. They will maintain and stabilize joints. That's supposed to say joints. That's going to haunt me for the rest of my days that I didn't put in that T in there, but that's all right. You all know what I mean. There's a T here. Let's imagine that. And they also produce body heat. So there are a few important things about the skeletal muscle that we need to talk about. There is first the Epimysium or the Epimysium. That is dense, irregular connective tissue that surrounds the entire skeletal muscle. There is a picture coming up after this slide, so don't worry if you're not quite sure what we're looking at here. Then you also have those muscle fibers within that large skeletal muscle that they are grouped within the larger muscle. Those are called fascicles. That is the groupings of muscle fibers. You have the Perimysium or the Perimysium. That is the covering of these fascicles. So within that larger muscle, these muscle fibers are grouped and they are covered in the Perimysium. So Epimysium means like upon or around. So epi, upon or around. That is around the entire muscle. Mys or mys there, that means anything referring to muscle, right? And peri means around, so that's around the muscle. This means upon, so think the entire muscle versus just parts of the muscle. Then you have the Endomysium, the Endomysium. That is a connective tissue that surrounds individual muscle fibers. Then all of these different kinds of connective tissue, the Epimysium, the Perimysium, the Endomysium, where they all come together at the end of a muscle, they form a tendon. Right? Let's take a look at this picture here. There we go. So you see here, you've got the Epimysium that surrounds the entire skeletal muscle. You can see this muscle right here. That covers this entire muscle. All right. Then you have all these little parts coming out here. And this right here is the Perimysium, and that surrounds these groupings of these fascicles here. All right. This whole thing that's telescoping out here is a fascicle that's wrapped up by the Perimysium. And then these individual muscle fibers, as they telescope out, those are all wrapped up by the Endomysium, right? And think endo, inside, right? Where all of these kind of come together at the end to connect onto bone, that is where the tendon is, right? So you can see a little bit in this picture here, a slide of that. Okay. All right. There are a few important things that you need to know as far as these muscles go when we're learning the different names and all of that. Like with the bones, we pretty much just needed to know the name of it, and you needed to be able to identify certain structures on these bones. Muscles are a little bit more complex because they actually do something individually, and they're not really the framework like the skeleton is. So we need to know a couple more things about them than we did with the bones. So the first thing that we need to know is that skeletal muscle connects to bones, usually. That is a pretty decent rule of thumb there. There are a couple places where that's not exactly true, but for the most part, that's what we're going with, all right? Skeletal muscle, they each have an insertion, and that's where the muscle attaches to a moving bone, to the bone that it's actually moving. And the origin is where that muscle attaches to a non-moving bone, okay? So if you think about, like if you just bend your forearm up to your upper arm, obviously your upper arm is the part that's not moving there, right? And the part that is moving is your forearm. So that's what we're talking about with the moving and non-moving bone. All right. There are 4 functional groups of these skeletal muscles in pretty much any kind of movement that the body's capable of. You have the agonist. That's the prime mover is another term you'll hear, but I generally like agonist because it honestly it sounds fancy. I don't know. But the agonist, that's the muscle that produces a specific movement. Okay. It's like when you're bringing your forearm up to your upper arm, your bicep brachii, the bicep muscle that we all know, that is the agonist there. Okay. Then you have the antagonist, which that's the muscle that works the opposite of the agonist. It either relaxes or it just stays still while the agonist is performing its function. For this, it's your triceps brachii, the muscle on the back of your arm. That's the antagonist to your biceps agonist for that specific movement. You also have the synergist. And that helps the agonist produce that specific movement either by just stabilizing the joint or by actually aiding in that movement itself. But it's not the primary mover. It's just helping that. And a fixator is just when the synergist helps when it actually immobilizes a bone so that the specific movement can be produced. So for each of these skeletal muscles that we're talking about, unless otherwise specifically mentioned, you'll need to know the insertion, the origin, as well as obviously the name, and you'll need to know the action of each of those muscles, right? We will talk a bit more about some of those things. So muscles, now that we know all the bones, muscle naming shouldn't be quite as much of a problem. There's definitely going to still be some things that you'll need to learn. It's not going to be exactly intuitive, but you'll see a bit of a pattern once we start learning these different muscles and these different muscle groups. They have some pretty regular conventions as far as how they are named. One of the big things that you'll see is the action determines a lot of how they're named. You'll see like the Extensor Digitorum. You could probably even right now guess what that muscle does. The Extensor Digitorum, I think extensor obviously means extend. And then digitorum, we've talked about the digits is your fingers, your phalanges. So that is the muscle that extends your digits, your fingers. You'll also see words like flexor, adductor, pronator. You'll see words like that. I think there's a supinator is another one that you may see. Those are all actions that we have talked about in class. You'll also see location as a big part of how muscles are named. You'll see where like the location of the muscle itself, like the intercostal muscles. We've talked about inner means between, and costal. Anything that says costal is referring to the ribs. So these are the muscles that exist in between all the ribs. You'll also see anterior, like your tibialis anterior, which that's the tibia, and it's on the anterior side, which anterior is front. You may see posterior, you'll see lateral or lateralis, medialis. You'll see words like that tell you where the muscle is actually located. You'll also see some of the names that refer to the location of the attachments, either the insertion or the origin. Like this very fun muscle here, the sternocleidomastoid. You see the sternum. Cleido, I don't know if we've talked about this as much, but cleido refers to the clavicle, your collarbone. And then mastoid, like where your mastoid process is on your skull. This muscle right here connects to all of these parts here. It attaches to the sternum, the clavicle, and the mastoid process. You'll also see the shape can sometimes be a significant part of a muscle's name, like the deltoid. Think delta, the symbol for change in any kind of science class you may have seen. The Greek symbol delta, it's like a triangle. That's kind of what the deltoid looks like if you look at it, I guess, upside down. It's kind of like that. But that's why it's called the deltoid, is because it is triangular. It looks like a Greek letter delta. There's also like rhombus, rhomboid muscles that we may talk about. Size is another big one that you'll see. The palmaris longus, longest obviously meaning long. Brevis, think brevity or brief, like short. You'll see maximus, minimus. You'll see all of these kind of words that describe the size of a muscle. And there's also direction of the fibers, the direction of the muscle fibers themselves. So rectus, if you remember that rectus means straight, then that will be extremely helpful in this unit. Like the rectus femoris, think femur. That's the one of the big muscles that runs straight up and down the femur. Then you have like the rectus abdominis. That's your main abdominal muscles that we think of. That's the ones that run straight up and down. You also have the transversus. You have oblique muscles. That like trans means across. Transversus is to run across. That's something to keep in mind. Then there's also number of origins, and this is one that we've talked about already. The biceps. This is the biceps femoris, which is the muscle, one of the muscles in the leg. But like your biceps brachii, think brachii. I guess maybe we haven't really talked about what that word specifically means, the arm, but it does. So now you know that. The biceps brachii, that means bi as in two, and seps as in head. So this has two heads. The triceps has three heads. Quadriceps has four heads. Okay. These are all really important to try to keep in mind. Every single muscle that you learn throughout this unit, it's important to try to identify which aspect of that it's like why it's named that. Okay. Honestly, if you pick this up well enough, then the muscle naming is going to be so much easier for you.